Right, let's get to work. Apologies, I'll have to make 2 videos today since I forgot one on Friday. Sincerest apologies on that front. But today, let us talk on internal divisions. Now, what I have drawn here is a map of ancient Greece, more or less. It's missing Magna Graecia or Greater Greece, along with all the areas in what was at the time held by Persia, so the Achaemenids, and it features several major cities that you might know if you've studied ancient Greece. Now, when it comes to places like Greece, the US, or really any country, there are always going to be cultural differences. That's just how things are. In the modern day, we've been able to somewhat consolidate our belief systems, our cultures. American beliefs, speech, culture, it's a lot more consolidated now. But even within that, there's a lot of difference. With social media, it's sort of dividing a bit, but it's still very much a consolidated mass, as opposed to what it used to be, which was far less consolidated. So let's use ancient Greece as an example so you can understand the internal divisions within a culture. For example, there's the Spartans and similar peoples in the south of the Peloponnese. I think it's Peloponnese, I could be mistaken. There's also Minoans here, or what's left of them, in what is now Rhodes. Or not Rhodes, Crete. Greek. And, of course, Akkadians, the Attic peoples, or the Athenians, the Macedonians, etc. Now, there's many more peoples in Greece, and several major groups that they fell under, like the Dorics and the like. But it's important to note that these different peoples and their different beliefs naturally played a role in how they operated. For example, Sparta tended to focus on the Peloponnese, this area here, and they extended further north. Athens, on the other hand, tended to focus on their islands, and needless to say, those areas were naturally closer to Sparta or Athens culturally, especially on the eve of the Peloponnesian War. The Macedonians, on the other hand, since they were at the edge of what we would call ancient Greece, were actually considered barbarians by some, despite participating in the Olympics, speaking Greek. Basically, they were Greeks in everything but the respect of their fellow Greeks until they finally came around from Pella and basically crushed everyone else. Thebes, on the other hand, was just another city-state, though they impressively actually beat the Spartans at their own game with a elite band of troops known as the Sacred Band, made up of a younger and an older who were partnered together. Now, some believe they were lovers. How true that is, I'm not going to say, because I don't study ancient Greek that specifically, but it is commonly believed, so for what it's worth, is that. And essentially, when it comes to these different peoples, they all spoke Greek. Like, if you were from Athens and you sent someone to Sparta, you didn't need to know a new language. Sure, they had an accent, a laconic one, but they were still very much Greek. They spoke the language. You went to Rhodes, they spoke the language as well. Crete, same thing. Pella and Macedon, same thing. Go over here to Byzantion, maybe, and you'd find the same. Those Greek cities, they all spoke the same language, just with different accents, accentuated by where they came from. For example, Syracuse spoke similar to Sparta, due to their close relations with them, as well as their settlers speaking this more Doric, I believe. Yeah, it was probably Doric. Speaking the more Doric dialect. Naturally, this carried on for other places, such as up here in what you would call Epirus. all of these different areas had their own unique things, their own cultures and distinctions. They were still Greek in culture. They still held that Greekness, that united Greek culture. They could read the same language, largely were related to each other, at least in terms of genetics and as a whole. And of course, they had similar histories, especially when it came to dealing with the Persians. They had the Trojan War story and all of these other things that united them, but they still had their distinctions. You would not call someone from Olympia a Corinthian or a Spartan. All of these guys were firmly different, and they held on to their distinctions with pride, especially Athens. Athens was egotistical, to say the least, in terms of how it acted towards other states, basically draining other states in their own alliance and putting it into Athens itself. In fact, Pericles, if you know civilization or actually study history, you know of Pericles. He actually drained the league that they ran, the Delian League, and put the money into Athens' treasury directly, or rather into the Parthenon, if I remember correctly. So essentially, Athens concentrated their power. Right, where were we? Apologies for the movement. We're no longer at the same table. My roommate went into my room and I don't want to bother him, so I'll film this one here. Though that does mean I don't have access to my aid for filming, so I'll be holding the camera. Anyways, back to internal divisions. As I mentioned, all of these cities had their own cultures and were distinct, despite sharing a larger culture. Even the United States, a country we now generally consider as one with an American people and an American culture, or just people saying, alright, we don't have a culture, still has notable differences between, say, the southern United States, Appalachia, the Midwest, the Northeast, etc., etc. All these areas have their own differences and distinctions. Indeed, Athens and Sparta naturally influenced their own neighbors in such a way that it made their way of doing things very, shall we say, influential or common among the rest of the Greek states. Indeed, Sparta was so renowned for its military that Thebes basically copied its initial idea, a professional army, and then compounded on that with a sacred band. Indeed, the Macedonians, when they made their plans to later unite the Greeks, heavily relied on the idea of, okay, we need a professional army, proper soldiers, and we need to use the phalanx that the Spartans had so perfected. And then the Thebans adopted. And the result was the Macedonian phalanx. All of these peoples interacted and shaped each other, and were still one culture. The Cretans, who basically sat on Minoan ruins, the Rhodians, who, interestingly enough, built a giant tower to the god Helios through the melted metal of a previous battle in which they won. The Spartans, the Athenians, Acadians, all of these peoples interacted and basically influenced each other. Sure, they were still separate peoples in part, but there's a reason we call it ancient Greece. They were still Greeks in their mind. They were still a single people. It's just, well, a Spartan and an Athenian spoke differently and had different ways of generally handling things. And this continues on throughout their history. Now let's talk about how people united these things. How this scattered amount of people turned into modern Greece. Again, apologies for the bad drawings. In the 1800s, we get the modern Greek state. They revolted from the Ottomans, and the great powers intervened to essentially say, no, Ottomans, you're not crushing these guys. These guys get to stay. Also, we get a lot of influence over the new Greek state. Hope you enjoy. Yeah, the great powers just kind of did that in the late Napoleonic, early Victorian era. Like, they still do it now. And so what they tried to do was essentially make an idea of what is Greek. What is the nation of Greece? And tried to unite all of these small cultures, which had devolved and evolved and shifted over the years, into one thing, one nation. So they said, all right, out with the Romanness that the Byzantines like to claim. Out with the we're Roman thing. No, we're Greek. And what does it mean to be Greek? Well, it means this, this, and this. They defined it, they Hellenized, meaning they basically made everything Greek. And then they said, okay, now where do the Greeks live? And so they made a claim on what is Greek territory. Basically, they're irredenta. And so over the course of the 1800s into the 1900s, that is what they pushed for, expanding the Greek state into what we have now, which is modern Greece, including Thessaly, Macedonia, southern Epirus, Rhodes, Crete, the Ionian Islands, Attica, the Dodecanese and Peloponnese, and the remaining territories, which I forgot the names of, apologies, alongside the territories that still were not yet claimed to form Greater Greece, this megali idea that the Greeks had especially during World War I. Northern Epirus, now held by Albania, Thrace, currently held by Turkey, and parts of Anatolia's coast, which a lot of Greek colonists from the past used to settle in, and actually still had a sizable Greek population even up until World War I, and Crete. All of these territories in the black are territories that were once claimed by Greece, which are now not held by them. They previously held some sway over most of these areas except Cyprus, because Cyprus was immediately occupied by the British, and that tends not to go well, but there was real talk of Cypriot unification with the rest of Greece for a while. And so, naturally, there was a lot of influence among these different places, and while even now there's still definitely a difference between, say, someone living up here in Thessalonica and someone living in Athens or any other city in Greece, there's a lot more of a unified culture because that was an active effort made by the nationalists in the 1800s and later compounded on by modern television. See, television, along with other media, allowed for sort of the unification of a people. Sure, you had the Olympics in the past, but with the modern Olympics, newspapers where everyone's reading the same stories, TV and telephones where people are communicating and the same shows are being watched. If a baseball tournament happened in Greece, let's say, or a football match, or soccer, whatever you want to call it, if one of those happened, they're tuning in, they're watching it, their players are doing this or that. It's a sort of joint community where these internal divisions consolidate into a more homogeneous entity. Now, they're still separate, there's still definitely differences, but the internal divisions have eased. Why? Because there's an interconnectivity that didn't exist back when Sparta and Athens were trying to kill each other, or when Pella decided to take over the rest of Greece. From the first birth of the modern Greek state until now, you see throughout it this constant push for essentially the idea of, okay, what is it that unites us? What makes us a nation, a people? Is it our histories? Is it our philosophers? Is it our general beliefs? Maybe our terrain? And so you have these things that make things Greek, and you unite them. Picture your image of what Greece is. You got in your head? It's a whole lot more complicated than that in reality. Greece is not simply what you see on a travel brochure or the history. It is all of that and more. But because of television, because of newspapers and mass media, you're able to unite this idea of what is Greece down from all of these competing city-states, these polities, into, well, first a state that actually existed, and then modern Greece. That and all. What Greece had was essentially a justification to be itself, one entity, united. It's the same thing with a lot of countries throughout our history and throughout the world, really. For example, the United States was hardly one thing when it first came into being. When people used to say the United States are instead of the United States is, That's not just something that we picked up from Spanish calling us Estados Unidos. No, it was a real thing where people identified more with their states, similar to how someone from Sparta would say, I'm a Spartan, before they'd say, I'm a Greek, or I'm a Hellene. They would say, I'm a Spartan. And it was the same thing in the early United States. You might say, I'm a Virginian. I'm a Massachusettan. What is a person from Massachusetts called? Maybe annoying? Yeah, regardless. Or Pennsylvanian, New Yorker, Rhode Islander, etc. Maybe people from Maine call themselves lobsters, who knows? Regardless, they would identify more with their states than they would with the country as a whole. It was only throughout the 1800s and leading into the 1900s that you'd get this idea of a unified American culture. It started with the newspapers, which eventually grew and grew, but it became even more of a thing with railroads connecting the country. When you could go from one side to the other in weeks when it would take you years or months. And television, baseball. A lot of you may not consider that, but think about it. In the past, when you were thinking of sports, you're probably thinking of your local sport, the kids playing a game over in the playground, or maybe some more professional teams in your neighborhood that like to play against each other, friends. But with modern sports, national sports like baseball, well, then everyone's reading the same thing. Everyone's looking to Babe Ruth, say, or some other player and thinking, hey, that guy's doing pretty good. And so they start supporting him, whether they're from California, New York, Florida, whatever. They look at them and they say, this guy's doing good. And it's the same thing here. Despite these internal divisions, Greece is still one country and one people. The United States is similar, though we're a bit more of an empire, because even we have a lot of distinctions within ourselves, even after all that homogenization that came from mass media. I mean, there's definitely a difference. If you go where I am currently, Pennsylvania, to Alaska, or down south, you're going to see a difference. A massive one. In terms of how people behave, how they think, how they view things. There's a reason why there's such a distinction between the North and the South when it comes to politics, and it ain't just the Civil War. These are different peoples who think in different ways. They're still part of the American nation as we might think of it, but they're distinct. These internal divisions, unlike the Greeks, hasn't really gone away. It hasn't really been homogenized. And it's true in other countries. France, for example. What we think of as French is really Parisian, which was spread throughout the rest of the country as standardization became a major factor. Same thing in Spain. Castilian is the main thing they use for Spanish. It's why, for example, you might go to Galicia and hear something different. Because the Galicians speak differently from the rest of the Spanish. In fact, from what I hear, it's closer to Portuguese than just standard Spanish. But that's the thing. Internal divisions exist. Even within a similar culture, there's going to be distinctions. People are going to be separate and have their own distinctions. It's not going to be 100%, but it is going to be there. And so, naturally, there's going to be results of that. And so, apologies again. As a result, there's going to be always a difference between the culture on a whole. Americans, Greeks, French, German, whatever. Could even be Japanese, Korean, Chinese, whatever you want to call it. Even within the larger cultures, there's always going to be distinctions, internal divisions. It would be wrong to paint them all with the same brush, which is commonly what I see. For example, when people say, oh, the ancient Greeks thought this. No, they didn't, as a unified rule. For example, imagine if we said that democratic Athens, which, by the way, the democracy wasn't even close to modern democracy. It was a whole thing, especially considering slavery was a big thing there and slaves couldn't vote. With Athens, imagine if we tried to paint all of the other Greek city-states like Athens, or all of them like Sparta. Sure, some people have done it, and it's stupid every time they do. But it is nonetheless a bad idea. It is stupid for a reason. Because Sparta, is not Corinth, it's not Olympia, it's not the Epirots, or the Macedonians. They're all distinct. Imagine if you tried to paint the entire United States like New England. That would be foolhardy in the best of occasions. These internal divisions, these cultural differences exist. It's not a bad thing, it's just a thing that happens and it occurs in reality because people are unique. People have different experiences. Someone in Appalachia is going to experience things differently than someone in the Rockies or someone out in the Great Plains. People will always be distinct, even as they try to form something united. There will always be some bits that are just different, or that don't fall to unity, and instead stay as their own distinct entities. That's just how things are. Even as we try to grasp that which can only be held in our dreams, or only be united through force of will or arms, there will always be that which tries to stay separate. That's just how things are. Division is just how people are. And while there are similarities, there will still be differences. You can never paint with a wide brush and be completely accurate. The ancient Greek stance on things is not uniform. The Spartans were a diarchy with an oligarchy backing them. The Athenians were a democracy, which turned into an oligarchy, then a democracy, thanks to a man named Alcibiades, Alcibiades is a whole deal. Look into him if you want to read something insane. The Macedonians were a monarchy as well, though a far more centralized one than Sparta. Thebes was just another city-state, though they definitely had their own skills going on. And Olympia decided to build a giant thing to Zeus. I don't blame them, but they did. And so, even when it comes to just governance, they are different. That's just how things are. They are distinct. Hardly uniform. So you can't just paint it like, oh, the ancient Greeks thought this. No, the ancient Greeks did not 100% think that. Some did, some didn't, some argued against it, some said, hey, no, that is absurd. It would be like painting Plato and Aristotle as the same. They are not. There are distinctions, and we should accept that. But also understand that even within the differences, there are commonalities. I hope you enjoy, and have a good one. Thank you for watching.